When I bought the farm, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. The land had been neglected for years, left to weeds and brush after the previous owner passed away. But to me, it was perfect. It sat on the edge of a sprawling suburban neighborhood, a patch of countryside that somehow hadn't yet been swallowed by development. The property had one problem, though there was only a single road that connected it to the main highway. That road cut through a neighborhood managed by the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. At the time, I didn't think much about it. The easement was legal, recorded in county documents decades ago. I had the right to use it, and I figured the neighbors would appreciate that I stuck to my side of the land, minding my own business. For the first few months, that was exactly how things went. I drove my truck along the narrow asphalt road each morning, waved politely when passing residents walked their dogs, and kept to myself. I cleared my fields, repaired the old barn, and dreamed of the farmhouse I would one day build. But then came Karen. Karen was the president of the Silver Pines HOA, and from the very beginning, she made it clear that she didn't like me, or the fact that my truck and equipment traveled her neighborhood's road. At first, it was little things. Disapproving stares from her front porch, notes taped to my windshield, warning that commercial vehicles weren't allowed. Strange delays when the HOA suddenly decided to repave her stretch of asphalt. I brushed it off as neighborhood politics. Karen was just another busybody with too much time and a clipboard, or so I thought. One morning, after hauling a trailer of lumber from the hardware store, I turned the corner toward my farm and stopped dead in my tracks. The road was blocked. At the neighborhood's entrance, right where the easement began, Karen and several HOA board members had installed a large metal gate. Bright reflective signs declared, "Private Road, CHOA members only." Chains and locks gleamed in the sun. My farm, my land, was cut off. I sat in my truck, staring at the gate, my heart pounding. The easement wasn't just an informal agreement. It was recorded, stamped, and binding. They had no right to block me, but Karen didn't seem to care. The HOA sent me a letter the following week, smugly explaining that non-resident traffic had become a nuisance and that effective immediately, access was restricted. They suggested that if I wanted to use the road, I could apply for special permission and pay monthly HOA dues, plus road maintenance fees. In other words, pay them or stay locked out. I tried reason at first. I contacted the county, showed them my paperwork, explained the easement. They agreed I had the right of way, but Karen and her HOA ignored every notice. Each time I called, they found new excuses, claiming my farm equipment was damaging their streets, or that my truck was a safety hazard. Meanwhile, the gate remained locked. Weeks went by, and I was forced to leave my truck parked by the highway, carrying supplies by hand across the fields like I was living in the 1800s. Every trip reminded me of how ridiculous the situation was. The land was mine. The road was legally mine to use. And yet Karen acted as though she owned everything she could see. But it wasn't just inconvenience. The blocked road was strangling my farm. Deliveries were delayed. Contractors I hired refused to work with me because they couldn't get their trucks past the gate. The barn repairs stalled. My dreams of turning the farm into something thriving began to crumble. And that's when I decided to fight back. Not with shouting matches at the gate, not with angry letters, not even with lawsuits, though those were coming. No, I realized that if I wanted to beat Karen at her own game, I had to think bigger. I had to outsmart her. The answer came to me one evening as I stood at the edge of my fields, staring at the wooded strip of land that ran parallel to the blocked road. Buried beneath those trees was an old drainage tunnel, carved decades ago when the creek overflowed each spring. It was half collapsed, hidden under brush and mud, but still there, and that's when the idea hit me. If Karen wanted to block me from the road, fine. I would make my own way. I began secretly digging. Each night, under cover of darkness, I worked at the old drainage path, clearing debris, reinforcing the walls, expanding it into something that could actually support a small vehicle. It was grueling work, hauling dirt, laying boards, reinforcing beams, but it gave me purpose. Every shovelful of dirt was a strike against Karen's arrogance. At first, it was just an experiment, but as the weeks went by, the tunnel grew longer, sturdier, more real. It became more than just a backup plan. It became my lifeline, and eventually, my weapon. Because while Karen and her HOA thought they had me cornered, cutting me off from the road and starving my farm, what they didn't know was that I was tunneling right under their noses. And when the time was right, I would use that tunnel to do more than just move supplies. I would use it to uncover the secrets they were hiding. The corruption, the lies, and the illegal schemes Karen thought would never see the light of day. The roadblock was supposed to break me. Instead, it pushed me to dig deeper, literally, and set in motion a plan that would bring the entire HOA crashing down. And Karen? She had no idea what was coming. The first few nights of digging felt like something out of a strange dream. By day, Karen and her HOA patrolled their streets like watchmen, strutting past the locked gate with smug satisfaction. But by night, under the cloak of silence, I became something else entirely. A man tunneling through the earth, clawing back the freedom that had been stolen from me. The tunnel was crude at first, just a widened path carved out of the old drainage ditch. The soil was dense and damp, and the air inside carried the heavy, earthy smell of decades of rot and runoff. I bought basic supplies under the radar: a headlamp, reinforced boards, a small generator, and a battered wheelbarrow. Slowly, the tunnel began to take shape, its walls shored up with wooden supports, its path stretching further under the ground. Each night I dug, sweat dripping, muscles aching, heart pounding in the claustrophobic dark. I measured progress not in feet but in inches. The work was brutal, but it gave me something no locked gate could take: control. Karen could watch the road all she wanted, but she couldn't see the ground beneath her feet. During the day, I pretended to struggle. I hauled supplies awkwardly from the highway, made a show of carrying heavy beams through the fields, and allowed Karen to believe she was winning. She liked to watch me from her front porch whenever I passed through the neighborhood on foot. I could see the smug grin on her face, as if my suffering validated her authority. But what Karen didn't realize was that while she sat in her lawn chair polishing her clipboard, her empire was slowly being undermined, literally. Weeks stretched into months. The tunnel became longer, straighter, stronger. I installed support beams, dug drainage channels to keep it dry, and even ran a small ventilation pipe to ensure I could breathe easily. It was grueling, dangerous work, but with each passing night, I grew closer to my goal. At first, the tunnel was just about access. I wanted a way to move supplies, maybe even a small cart, without relying on the blocked road. But as the tunnel pushed further beneath the HOA's land, I realized something else. I was beneath their neighborhood. The thought thrilled me. While Karen preached rules and fines above ground, I was silently burrowing under her carefully manicured world. The deeper I went, the more I realized how fragile her authority really was. She had power only as long as people believed in it. Underground, her power meant nothing. One evening, as I expanded a new section of the tunnel, my shovel hit something hard. At first, I thought it was just another stone, but when I cleared away the dirt, I found something unexpected: a buried pipe. Not just any pipe, an illegal one. The pipe ran straight from the HOA's clubhouse, carrying what appeared to be wastewater directly into the creek that bordered my farm. The smell alone told me it wasn't properly treated. I followed the line further and found it connected to several other smaller pipes, drainage from homes, sewage that had been diverted away from the city's treatment system. The HOA was running an illegal sewer line under their own neighborhood, dumping waste straight into the water supply. I felt a surge of disgust and adrenaline. This wasn't just about Karen being petty. This was corruption, a deliberate scheme to save money at the expense of the environment and public health. And it was happening directly beneath their shiny lawns and picket fences. Suddenly, the tunnel wasn't just my escape route. It was my evidence. I began documenting everything. I bought a cheap camera, rigged lights inside the tunnel, and filmed the pipes, the flow, the connections. I marked the spots on a map, creating a clear picture of just how widespread the illegal system was. Each discovery felt like a nail in the HOA's coffin. Meanwhile, above ground, Karen grew bolder. The HOA sent more letters, this time threatening lawsuits if I trespassed on their road again. They fined me thousands of dollars for disrupting the community's peace and lowering property values. Once, when I parked near the gate to drop off supplies, Karen marched out with her phone in hand, filming me like I was some kind of criminal. What she didn't know was that every time she smiled smugly into her camera, I already had hours of footage buried beneath her streets, footage that could destroy everything she'd built. But Karen's arrogance didn't stop at blocking my road. She began organizing meetings with her HOA board, convincing them that I was a dangerous influence and that the neighborhood needed stricter rules. Families were fined for leaving trash cans out too long. Kids were banned from riding bikes on certain streets, and residents whispered angrily about how Karen was turning Silver Pines into a prison. The more power she seized, the more she exposed herself. Neighbors who once looked the other way began to push back. Anonymous notes appeared on bulletin boards mocking her rules. Quiet conversations in driveways grew louder, filled with resentment. But no one dared to openly defy her. Karen still held the clipboard, and the HOA's power was still absolute, at least on the surface. By the time summer arrived, my tunnel reached the other side of the blocked road. I had done it. I created a direct path from my farm to the highway, bypassing Karen's gate entirely. I could move supplies freely again, bring in trucks, even slip in and out without anyone noticing. But more importantly, I had the evidence. One night, I stood in the middle of the tunnel. My camera pointed at the illegal pipes and realized just how deep Karen's corruption went. It wasn't just about sewage. If she and the HOA had covered this up for years, what else were they hiding? Financial fraud? Misused dues? Secret deals with contractors? The pieces began to connect. Karen had always carried herself like a queen, but her kingdom was rotting beneath the surface. And I was the one digging up the truth. Still, I knew I had to be careful. If Karen caught even a whiff of what I was doing, she would stop at nothing to crush me. The tunnel was my secret weapon, and for now, secrecy was my greatest advantage. So I waited. I bided my time gathering evidence, strengthening my case, and building alliances quietly with the few neighbors brave enough to speak against Karen. Because when the moment came to expose her, I didn't want to just win. I wanted her empire to collapse in front of the entire neighborhood, and little did Karen know, the cracks in her perfect little world were already spreading. The summer heat hung thick over Silver Pines, baking the neighborhood's manicured lawns and spotless driveways. Karen's empire gleamed on the surface. Every hedge was trimmed, every car parked perfectly within regulation, every mailbox painted the approved shade of off-white. To outsiders, Silver Pines looked like a picture-perfect community, but beneath the facade, the cracks were widening. The illegal sewage line I had uncovered was only the beginning. As I expanded the tunnel, I stumbled across more signs of corruption. Hidden utility lines spliced into the county's system, electrical wiring patched together without permits. Even a stash of barrels buried under the HOA's clubhouse that smelled strongly of paint thinner and chemicals. All of it pointed to years of cutting corners and hiding evidence, saving money while putting residents at risk. I documented everything. My nights became a blur of digging, recording, and mapping. By the time dawn broke, my hands were blistered and my body ached. But my camera was full of proof. Proof that could ruin Karen and the entire HOA. But while I worked in the shadows, Karen's grip on the neighborhood grew tighter. She had taken the gate a step further, hiring private security guards to patrol the entrance. They wore cheap uniforms and carried clipboards, but their presence sent a message. Karen was untouchable. Residents whispered complaints but obeyed her rules. Fines arrived in mailboxes like clockwork, and anyone who resisted found themselves the subject of Karen's wrath. She thrived on fear, and for a while it seemed to work. Families stopped holding backyard parties after Karen threatened noise citations. Kids were forbidden from leaving bikes on lawns. Even Christmas decorations were scrutinized for community violations. But something had changed. The residents were growing tired. The endless fines, the bullying, the way Karen strutted through the neighborhood as though she were mayor of a small kingdom, it was wearing thin. I could see it in their faces when I passed through, when I overheard hushed conversations at the grocery store. They were scared, yes, but they were also angry. Karen couldn't see it. She believed her power was absolute. But power built on intimidation is fragile, and I was holding the evidence that could shatter it. My secret tunnel became more than just an escape route. It became a weapon. Through it, I slipped into the heart of Silver Pines unnoticed. I could emerge near the clubhouse or behind Karen's house, always unseen. From the shadows, I observed her routines, the meetings she held in the clubhouse late at night, the envelopes exchanged between her and contractors, the way she laughed with her board members about teaching people lessons through fines. The deeper I dug, both literally and figuratively, the more I realized Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was running Silver Pines like a personal business. Residents' dues were being siphoned into maintenance projects that never happened. Contractors were paid for work that was never completed. And all the while, Karen lived comfortably, her lifestyle funded by the very people she oppressed. But as much as I wanted to expose her immediately, I knew timing was everything. If I acted too soon, she'd bury the evidence, spin the story, and paint herself as the victim. I needed the residents on my side. I needed them to see her corruption with their own eyes. And then, almost by accident, the opportunity presented itself. One evening, as I reviewed footage from the tunnel, I noticed something strange. One of the pipes I had filmed was leaking, not just a trickle, but a steady stream. It flowed into the creek, discoloring the water, sending a foul stench into the air. By morning, fish floated belly up along the banks of my property. The pollution was spreading. I knew it was only a matter of time before residents noticed the smell. The creek ran directly past several backyards in Silver Pines, a favorite play spot for children. The HOA couldn't cover this up forever, but I could make sure the truth pointed back to them. I printed stills from my footage, clear images of the illegal pipes, the sewage flow, the connections leading back to the clubhouse. I slipped copies into unmarked envelopes and left them on the porches of several residents. Not everyone, just a select few. Families I'd seen whispering their frustrations. People who I knew were already questioning Karen's authority. The reaction was immediate. By the end of the week, word had spread like wildfire. At first, it was only whispers. Concerned parents talking about the creek, neighbors wondering if the HOA had cut corners. But soon the anger grew louder. Small groups gathered in driveways. Residents demanded answers at board meetings. Karen, true to form, dismissed their concerns with a wave of her hand, insisting the photos were fake and accusing outsiders of trying to sabotage the community. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. Karen responded the only way she knew how, by doubling down. She issued more fines, sent threatening letters, and banned residents from discussing community matters outside of official meetings. She even accused a few outspoken neighbors of violating slander rules and threatened legal action. But fear no longer worked the way it used to. People were angry now, and once fear turns to anger, control begins to slip. From the shadows of my tunnel, I watched it all unfold. Karen didn't realize it, but her empire was crumbling. The residents she thought were loyal were beginning to see through the cracks, and I hadn't even shown them the full extent of what I had uncovered. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen suspected something. She had grown more paranoid, watching the streets from her porch, interrogating anyone who lingered too long near the clubhouse. She even started sending her security guards into the woods, flashlights cutting through the darkness, searching for something. They never found the tunnel, but their presence reminded me of the risk. If Karen discovered what I was doing, she wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. She had already tried to choke off my farm. What would she do if she learned I was the one digging beneath her neighborhood? One night, as I emerged from the tunnel near the creek, I caught sight of Karen standing by the locked gate, clipboard in hand, whispering furiously into her phone. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her body, the way she clutched the pen in her hand like a weapon. She was losing control, and she knew it, but she still believed she could outlast me. She still believed her title, her clipboard, and her fake rules gave her power. She didn't realize that the very ground beneath her was betraying her, that her corruption was bubbling to the surface, impossible to contain. And soon, when the time was right, I would make sure everyone saw the truth, because Karen might have blocked my road, but I had dug much deeper than she ever could. The storm had been brewing in Silver Pines for months, but by midsummer, it finally broke. The once pristine neighborhood no longer looked so perfect. The grass along the curbs browned from neglect, and trash bins left out too long signaled that even the smallest rules were being ignored. The air was no longer filled with neighborly waves and polite smiles, but with suspicion and whispers. Karen noticed. Her clipboard, once a symbol of absolute control, had lost its sting. Residents rolled their eyes when she marched down the street, pretending to jot notes about mailbox paint and hedge heights. The whisper campaigns she dismissed as nonsense were now louder, bolder, and undeniable. People no longer feared her fines the way they once did, but Karen was not the type to admit defeat. She was the type to double down. The first sign of her desperation came in the form of surveillance. Security guards, who once lazily patrolled the gated entrance, now prowled the streets at all hours. Cameras sprouted like weeds, mounted on light poles, perched on rooftops, even hidden in shrubs near the clubhouse. Karen wanted eyes everywhere, convinced that if she could catch her enemies in the act, she could restore her empire. But paranoia is a dangerous fuel. It burns hot, consumes quickly, and often destroys the one who feeds it. Karen's surveillance turned Silver Pines into a cage. Families who once tolerated her rules now felt trapped. Children no longer played in the creek. Neighbors hesitated to step outside without looking over their shoulders. And though Karen insisted the cameras were for safety, everyone knew the truth. They were there to remind people of her power. Yet power built on fear is fragile. And with every new camera, every late-night patrol, Karen's desperation became clearer. Meanwhile, beneath her kingdom, I continued to dig. The tunnel stretched further than I ever imagined, a hidden artery running directly under Silver Pines. By now, I could emerge behind nearly any house in the neighborhood. From my underground vantage point, I had uncovered even more evidence. Forged inspection reports, storage areas filled with unapproved chemicals, and most damning of all, ledgers hidden in the clubhouse basement. The ledgers were a gold mine. They detailed years of fraudulent expenses, payments made to shell companies owned by Karen's relatives, maintenance fees pocketed instead of spent, and inflated costs for projects that never happened. Each line of ink was a nail in her coffin, proof that Silver Pines wasn't a well-run neighborhood, but a personal bank for Karen and her allies. But if Karen was paranoid before, the discovery of the creek pollution had made her nearly unhinged. She began targeting residents she suspected of leaking information. Families who had received my anonymous envelopes suddenly found themselves fined for petty violations. Trash cans left out 10 minutes too long, garden gnomes deemed unsightly, even flowers labeled as unapproved species. Her wrath was no longer subtle. It was direct, vindictive, and messy. The neighborhood started to fracture. Some residents, worn down by Karen's retaliation, bent under the pressure. They paid their fines, stayed quiet, and tried to avoid her gaze. But others fought back. They filed complaints with the county. They organized small meetings in garages, whispering about Karen's corruption. For the first time, Karen was facing resistance not just from me, but from within her own walls. But Karen was clever in her cruelty. When whispers grew too loud, she staged a community event at the clubhouse, a thinly veiled attempt to reassert control. She filled the room with snacks, decorations, and her usual charm, pretending as if nothing was wrong. But behind the fake smiles and sugary speeches, her message was clear. She was still in charge, and anyone who opposed her would face consequences. And yet, even as she tightened her grip, the evidence I held was becoming too heavy to ignore. The sewage spill had sparked suspicion, but the ledgers, the photos, the recordings, they could spark a revolution. The question was, when to strike? Timing was everything. If I released the information too soon, Karen could spin it, bury it, or twist it into another weapon. But if I waited too long, the neighborhood might break completely, leaving residents too defeated to fight back, and Karen, perhaps sensing that her empire was cracking, launched her boldest move yet. Late one night, as I worked in the tunnel, I heard the crunch of boots above me. A flashlight beam swept across the ground, followed by the low murmur of voices. Karen's security guards were in the woods again, but this time they weren't just patrolling. They were digging. Karen had figured it out. Maybe she didn't know the full extent of the tunnel, but she knew something was happening beneath her feet. Her paranoia had pushed her to act, and now her guards were searching for the very thing I had spent months building. For the first time, I felt fear gnaw at my resolve. If they found the tunnel, everything would collapse. The evidence, the ledgers, the photos, it would all be lost. And worse, Karen would know exactly who had been undermining her kingdom. I worked through the night, reinforcing weak spots, creating false branches to mislead anyone who dug too close. I moved evidence into hidden caches, safe from prying eyes. Every hour was a battle against time, and every sound from above set my heart racing. But Karen's obsession had blinded her. Instead of focusing on repairing her image or addressing the residents' concerns, she poured all her energy into hunting shadows. Her guards tore up patches of forest, trampled through backyards, and questioned anyone seen near the creek. The more she searched, the more suspicious the residents became. Why was Karen so desperate? Why was she spending HOA money on midnight digs and private security instead of fixing the pollution, repairing fences, or maintaining the playground? Her paranoia was doing what I alone could not. It was turning her residents against her. And then came the breaking point. One afternoon, as the sun beat down on Silver Pines, a group of residents gathered outside the clubhouse. They weren't there for a meeting. They were there to protest. Signs appeared, homemade, scrawled with phrases like, "Where are our dues?" and "Fix the creek." Voices rose, angry and unified. Karen emerged, clipboard in hand, her light blue blouse immaculate as ever, and tried to shout them down. But this time they didn't listen. Her voice, once sharp enough to cut through silence, was drowned out by chants and accusations. The Queen of Silver Pines was losing her crown. From my tunnel exit near the clubhouse, I watched it unfold. The rebellion I had hoped for was happening, fueled not just by my evidence but by Karen's own arrogance. She had built her kingdom on intimidation, and now, stripped of its power, she looked smaller than ever. But the battle wasn't over. Karen still held the title, the paperwork, and the illusion of authority. She would not go quietly, and she would not forgive those who defied her. I knew her next move would be her most dangerous yet. And so, as the residents shouted and the clubhouse trembled with anger, I slipped back into the tunnel. The final stage was approaching, and if I timed it right, Karen's downfall would be complete. The evidence was ready. The people were ready. And soon, Silver Pines would see the truth buried beneath its perfect lawns. By the time autumn arrived, Silver Pines no longer resembled the pristine neighborhood that Karen had paraded as her personal kingdom. What was once a quiet, manicured community now felt like a pressure cooker. The lawns were unkempt, fences leaned with disrepair, and the air buzzed not with the sound of children playing, but with the constant hum of tension. Every corner carried whispers, every window framed eyes that watched for Karen's next move. The residents had begun to lose their fear. The protest outside the clubhouse had been the first spark, but it had lit a fire that was spreading through every cul-de-sac. More families ignored Karen's citations, refusing to pay fines. Others quietly canceled their automatic HOA payments, starving the association of its lifeblood. Even those who once stood by Karen grew tired of her constant paranoia and her refusal to fix the pollution poisoning the creek. But Karen, true to her nature, refused to back down. Instead of softening, she escalated. Her newest weapon came in the form of lawsuits. Residents who dared to question her found thick envelopes taped to their doors, summons for violations and unpaid dues. Karen had weaponized the courts, hoping the threat of legal fees would break the rebellion's back. She believed that if she couldn't rule through fear of fines, she would rule through the terror of debt. But this tactic only fanned the flames further. News of the lawsuits spread quickly, and neighbors who once stayed silent began to organize in earnest. Meetings moved from garages to living rooms, then to larger gatherings in barns and rented halls outside the gates. Karen's iron grip was cracking, and for the first time, she faced a unified front. All the while beneath her streets, I continued my work. The tunnel had become more than just a secret passage. It was the foundation of Karen's downfall. I had used it to map every illegal pipe, every fraudulent ledger, and every hidden storage room in the clubhouse basement. My evidence was now overwhelming, enough to bury not only Karen but the entire HOA board. Still, I knew timing was critical. I couldn't simply dump the information online and hope for the best. Karen was cunning, and she would spin the narrative, crying conspiracy and painting herself as a victim. No, if I wanted to expose her corruption, I needed to do it in a way that left no room for doubt. The residents had to see it with their own eyes, all at once. But Karen wasn't idle either. Her paranoia had reached a fever pitch. Security patrols doubled, then tripled. Guards now wore tactical gear, strutting through the neighborhood as though Silver Pines was a military base instead of a suburban community. Karen herself rarely left her house without a small entourage, and when she did, her piercing voice carried through the streets, lecturing, threatening, warning. Then one fateful night, she crossed the final line. I was deep in the tunnel, reinforcing a wall near the creek when I heard something unusual. A low rumble like engines idling, followed by the sharp bark of orders. I hurried to one of my hidden exits and peered out. What I saw made my stomach turn. Karen had brought in heavy machinery. Backhoes, dump trucks, even a small drilling rig. She wasn't just looking for my tunnel anymore, she was planning to destroy it. It was clear what she intended. By digging up the woods, she would not only collapse the tunnel, but also erase the evidence of the illegal sewer lines that I had documented. She wanted to bury her crimes as literally as possible, but her desperation betrayed her. In tearing up the land, she couldn't hide from the residents anymore. They watched as their HOA dues were wasted on earth movers and bulldozers. They whispered in horror as guards blocked the streets, preventing children from riding their bikes and families from leaving their driveways. Karen insisted it was for safety, but the truth was obvious. She was trying to cover her tracks. That night, I made my decision. Waiting any longer would risk losing everything. It was time to strike. I spent the next few days preparing. Every photo, every video, every document I had collected was organized into neat folders and labeled. I made copies, both digital and physical, ensuring that even if Karen destroyed one set, the truth could still be revealed. I contacted local environmental agencies anonymously, sending them enough evidence of the sewage dumping to guarantee they would launch an investigation. And most importantly, I reached out quietly to the residents, letting them know to gather at the clubhouse for a special meeting. The stage was set. On the night of the meeting, Silver Pines buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in years. Dozens of families crowded the streets, their faces lit by porch lights and phone screens. The air was thick with anticipation. Karen arrived last, her light blue blouse crisp, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her guards flanked her, but even they looked uneasy in the face of so many angry neighbors. Karen climbed the clubhouse steps and raised her voice, trying to seize control. She barked about rules, about order, about how the community was under attack by outsiders who wanted to destroy everything they had built. But her words rang hollow. The residents had heard it all before, and this time they weren't buying it. That was when I made my move. From the back of the crowd, I wheeled out a projector and a screen. Murmurs rippled through the residents as I powered it on, and the first image flickered to life, a photograph of the illegal sewage pipe dumping into the creek. Gasps echoed through the crowd. I let the pictures roll. Each one revealed a deeper layer of corruption. Hidden pipes, storage rooms filled with unapproved chemicals, pages of falsified ledgers showing money funneled into Karen's accounts. The more evidence I presented, the louder the crowd grew. Shock turned to anger, and anger turned to outrage. Karen tried to shout me down, her voice shrill and desperate, but the residents no longer listened. They pointed at the screen, demanding answers, demanding accountability. Some of them shouted about the sickness their children had suffered, about the money they had wasted on dues, about the lies they had been fed for years. Karen's empire was crumbling before her eyes. In a final act of desperation, she ordered her guards to seize me and shut down the presentation. But by then it was too late. Dozens of residents had their phones out, recording every word, every image. The truth was no longer mine to hold, it belonged to everyone. Chaos erupted. Neighbors swarmed the guards, shouting them down, blocking their path. Karen's shrill commands were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. For the first time in her reign, she was powerless. The final straw had been pulled, and the house of cards collapsed. By the end of the night, the residents had voted to suspend Karen and the entire HOA board pending investigation. They demanded immediate access to the association's financial records, and they vowed to dismantle the corrupt system that had ruled their lives for so long. Karen, red-faced and trembling, was escorted back to her house, not as a queen, but as a prisoner of her own making, and as the projector shut off and the crowd began to disperse, I slipped back into the shadows, my work almost done. The battle wasn't fully over, but the war was nearly won. The neighborhood had seen the truth. And Karen had finally lost the one thing she cherished most: control. The morning after the showdown at the clubhouse, Silver Pines no longer felt like the same neighborhood. The perfectly trimmed hedges, the spotless sidewalks, and the pastel-colored houses stood exactly where they always had. But their illusion of control had been shattered. For years, Karen's rules had painted over the cracks like a layer of cheap wallpaper. Now, with the evidence exposed and her authority crumbling, those cracks were visible to everyone. Residents walked their dogs without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Children played in the cul-de-sacs again, their laughter replacing the silence that had hung heavy for months. For the first time in years, people felt free on their own streets. But as much as the neighborhood sighed with relief, the fight was not yet over. Karen was not someone who surrendered easily. After storming out of the meeting humiliated, she holed herself up in her house. Her porch lights burned through the night, and her voice carried through the thin walls, barking into her phone as if sheer volume could claw back the power she had lost. Neighbors whispered that board members came and went at all hours, slipping in through the side door with stacks of paperwork. Karen was planning something bigger than fines, bigger than citations. Her counterstrike came quickly. Within 48 hours, a glossy, professionally printed letter appeared in every mailbox. Karen claimed that everything shown at the meeting was fabricated, malicious lies, as she called them, spread by a disgruntled outsider who wanted to destroy Silver Pines. She insisted the sewage pipes were harmless drainage. The ledgers had been misinterpreted, and the chemicals were part of routine maintenance. In her version of reality, nothing was wrong, but the residents were no longer blind. They had seen the pictures. They had recorded the evidence themselves. More importantly, they had lived under Karen's thumb for too long to believe her sudden cries of innocence. The letter that Karen thought would rally her kingdom only deepened the rebellion. Families openly refused to pay dues. Homeowners posted signs in their yards that read, "We are not Karen's property." Small gatherings of neighbors turned into large assemblies. The whisper of dissent had grown into a roar, and that roar drew in more than just the residents. Within a week, county inspectors arrived. Their white trucks and official clipboards caused a stir as they toured the creek, examined the illegal sewer pipes, and demanded entry into the clubhouse. What they found confirmed everything I had uncovered: years of fraud, illegal dumping, and falsified reports. The inspectors' grim faces told the story even before the results were public. Silver Pines was in violation of multiple county, state, and environmental codes. Karen's precious clipboard suddenly looked like a toy compared to the power of actual authority. The neighborhood buzzed with nervous energy. Some feared the fines and penalties would bankrupt them all. Others, though, felt a deep, intoxicating satisfaction. For the first time, it wasn't Karen holding the power. It was the law. And the law was aimed squarely at her. But Karen wasn't done. When the inspectors returned with official citations, Karen staged her last stand. She emerged on the clubhouse steps in her trademark light blue blouse, hair carefully styled, as if appearances alone could rewrite reality. She raised her voice to a shrill pitch, shouting about conspiracies, accusing the inspectors of corruption, and declaring herself the only rightful authority in Silver Pines. Her words might have worked months ago. But now, her audience wasn't nodding neighbors. It was a crowd armed with phones. Dozens of residents recorded every moment, uploading her tirade online. And just like that, Karen went viral. Her rant spread across social media, not as a speech of strength, but as a display of desperation. Strangers mocked her self-importance, stitched her videos with sarcastic commentary, and turned her shrill voice into memes. Silver Pines, once a quiet suburban enclave, had become a national spectacle. For Karen, the humiliation was unbearable. In the days that followed, her behavior grew even more erratic. She tried to rally her shrinking circle of loyal board members, but most resigned quietly, unwilling to sink with her ship. She stalked the streets alone, yelling at children, scribbling frantic notes about violations that no one cared about anymore. She was a queen without a crown, ruling a kingdom that had abandoned her, and then the inevitable happened. On a gray Tuesday morning, squad cars rolled quietly through the gates. Officers stepped out calmly, their presence more commanding than any of Karen's bluster could ever be. Neighbors peeked through curtains, gathering in driveways as the officers walked up the path to Karen's house. She tried to resist, tried to wave her HOA paperwork as if it held legal power, but authority built on lies crumbles in the face of real justice. The sight of Karen being led away in handcuffs was surreal. For years, she had strutted these streets as if she owned them. Now she shuffled down the walkway, pale and trembling, clutching her clipboard like it could shield her from reality. The residents watched in silence at first, then in murmurs, and finally in cheers. The Queen of Silver Pines had fallen. The fallout was swift. The county seized the HOA's records, launched formal investigations into the misappropriated funds, and shut down the illegal sewage lines. Cleanup crews descended on the creek, finally addressing years of contamination. Environmental groups announced lawsuits. The HOA, once feared and unchallenged, was dismantled piece by piece. For the residents, it was the end of an era. Some worried about the future. Without an HOA, who would maintain the roads, the parks, the clubhouse? But others saw freedom where there had once been chains. They gathered in community meetings, not under Karen's watchful glare, but as equals, deciding together how to manage their neighborhood. For the first time, they had a voice. And as for me, I stood at the edge of the creek one evening, watching the water flow clearer than it had in years. My tunnel, the secret passage that had started as a desperate escape, had become the very thing that unraveled Karen's empire. From beneath her feet, I had exposed every lie, every scam, every abuse of power. The tunnel was no longer needed, but I couldn't bring myself to collapse it. It stood as a reminder, not of escape, but of resistance. A symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to bow to tyranny, even if that tyranny comes dressed in pastel blouses and armed with clipboards. Silver Pines would recover. Grass would regrow, fences would be repaired, and laughter would return to the streets. But the story of Karen, the HOA president who ruled with an iron fist until the ground literally gave way beneath her, would never be forgotten. Her downfall wasn't just a victory for one farmer whose road had been blocked. It was a victory for every neighbor who had been fined, every child who had been silenced, and every family who had felt trapped in their own home. Karen thought she owned Silver Pines. She thought she owned me. But in the end, it wasn't her road or her rules or her kingdom. It was ours. And now, free from her reign, it always would be.